What if the emperor of mankind was never the architect of a grand plan? What if he was completely blindsided by events and madly scrambling to keep up? That's the prosecution's opening statement. The evidence for it sits inside the canon, arranged in a sequence the Imperium's own mythology works extremely hard to prevent you from reading in order. A previous video built this case to a particular point and left 3 joints unsoldered. It never named Slaanesh, never named Molech, and never addressed what happens to the Emperor's entire strategic foundation when you apply warp temporal mechanics to the transaction he made on that planet. Those 3 gaps are what this closes. There's also a 4th thread the predecessor kept as 2 separate discussions that are actually one causal chain: the Great Crusade's breakneck pace and the Emperor's fear of rival human civilizations. We'll join those. But first, the defense deserves its strongest formulation. The defenders of the Emperor's omniscience build their case on a foundation that is emotionally and canonically solid. He has spent 10,000 years decaying, alone, and in great pain on the Golden Throne to keep humanity going. His body is a ruin sustained by 1,000 psychers sacrificed to him daily. His existence is a sustained act of suffering that makes the Golden Throne one of the most genuinely tragic images the setting has produced. A being who perceives the shape of galactic history while mortal civilizations are still discovering metallurgy, whose psychic capability outstrips every other human who ever lived, who has held the Astronomicon blazing in the warp for 100 centuries from a deteriorating corpse. The defenders point at all of that and ask, with reasonable force, what meaningful sense you can attach to the word blindsided when describing a being of this scale. The canon gives them explicit support. The lore around the Great Crusade states that the Emperor had long foreseen the birth of Slaanesh and laid plans accordingly. Add to it that he was a perpetual, a being who regenerated from death, whose lifespan stretched back tens of thousands of years before the first Space Marine Legion set foot on a non-Terran world. And the image that emerges is of someone whose perspective was measured in geological time rather than political cycles. His psychic capability is described in the established lore as constantly keeping the Chaos Gods at bay, preventing their intrusion into the material universe. Steel-manned fully, the Emperor is a being who saw the broad shape of history the way a cartographer reads a continent, who accepted extraordinary and prolonged suffering as the cost of a plan that was the only visible alternative to human extinction, and who is still, 10,000 years on, keeping the lights on for a civilization that would collapse within hours if his will failed. The prosecution accepts all of that as factually true. What it disputes is what those facts prove. Foresight and omniscience aren't the same category of thing. Seeing billions of possible futures tells you the territory. It doesn't tell you which path you're currently walking. And the Emperor's actual decision record, traced in sequence from Molech forward, suggests a being who kept arriving at junctures where his prior arrangement had been overtaken by events he hadn't fully controlled, who plugged each breach, covered the evidence, improvised a new position, and hoped the structure held until the next breach appeared. The pattern starts at Molech, which is where everything starts, whether the Imperium acknowledges it or not. Graham McNeil's Vengeful Spirit is the 29th novel in the Black Library's Horus Heresy series, and it's the canonical source for what the Emperor did on the planet Molech. The account doesn't require interpretive gymnastics to be significant. The plain sequence of events is enough. Before the Great Crusade began, before a single legion had left Terra in organized force, before the first world had been brought to compliance, the Emperor traveled to Molech. The planet itself is described in the novel as seemingly insignificant, an unremarkable world with no obvious strategic value. The significance lives beneath that surface, a warp gate, a physical metaphysical doorway connecting the material universe to the realm of chaos, the domain of the dark gods. The Emperor entered it. He made some form of transaction with the chaos powers. He emerged with new power, and that power is the mechanism behind the creation of the Primarchs. The established lore on the pact is explicit. The Emperor sought the power to imbue his sons with aspects of his own soul. Stop on the structural weight of that chain, because every subsequent argument rests on it. The Primarchs are 20 demigod sons, each a vessel for a fragment of the Emperor's soul, each designed to lead a Space Marine Legion as the command layer of the greatest military campaign in human history. The Legions, hundreds of thousands of Astartes warriors, the military spine of the Crusade, are built around the Primarchs as their genetic templates and their commanders. Remove what came out of that warp gate, and the Primarchs don't exist. Without the Primarchs, the Crusade's command structure doesn't exist. The entire strategic architecture of the Great Crusade traces back to a transaction made inside the realm of chaos on a planet that barely registers on any Imperial map. That's not a detail buried in the corner of the lore. That is the load-bearing foundation. The Emperor of Mankind, the Supreme Rationalist, the architect of the Imperial Truth, which declared the gods to be superstition and the warp to be merely a phenomenon to be understood and managed like any other. He walked through that door and negotiated with what the Imperium's own theology would later classify as the fundamental enemies of humanity. What exactly changed hands in the transaction is where the canon fractures into competing readings that Vengeful Spirit itself doesn't fully resolve. One reading frames it as a genuine bargain with stated terms. The Dark Gods would teach the Emperor to master the warp in exchange for something promised. A second argues he deceived them, entered the realm, took what he needed, and gave nothing in return, which is why certain lore frames the Horus heresy as debt collection, the Chaos Gods treating the entire heresy as a mechanism for extracting what the Emperor had defaulted on. A third positions the visit as spiritual combat, the Emperor entering the warp to confront the Dark Gods directly, with the gods failing to bind him. A fourth reading, drawn from what the power apparently did to the Emperor's own nature, suggests he absorbed the positive aspects of the Chaos God's essence, which offers a functional explanation for why Space Marines, the Custodes, and Imperial Saints exhibit such resilience against chaos corruption compared to other mortals. All four interpretations share one common structural truth. There was a transaction, something was acquired, and it passed through a gate that opened onto the realm of chaos. Whether he bargained, stole, fought, or absorbed, he crossed into the most dangerous metaphysical territory in the setting and came back changed, carrying something the material universe couldn't have provided him. The Supreme Rationalist needed the irrational to build his rational empire. What he did immediately afterward is as telling as what happened inside. He reinforced Molech's planetary defenses. He stationed a guardian, reportedly a perpetual, a being who regenerates from death and can't be permanently killed, to watch over the gate. The world was garrisoned. The access point was maintained. This isn't the behavior of someone who considered the transaction concluded, the gate's purpose exhausted, the risk contained. This is preservation, the Emperor keeping the door open, keeping it guarded, keeping whatever might come through it in a state of managed access rather than closed-off finality. On subsequent visits to Molech during the early stages of the Great Crusade, he brought some of his Primarchs with him. They were there. They saw something, enough that the Emperor subsequently felt it necessary to address what they knew. He reached into his son's memories and removed information. Not prevention of exposure. The exposure had already happened. Retroactive damage control, applied to the minds of 20 demigod warriors who had already glimpsed the thing their father had decided they couldn't be trusted to retain. The precision of this is worth noting. He didn't bring them to Molech and keep them away from the sensitive parts. He brought them, allowed the exposure, and then corrected for it after the fact. The sequence suggests a being managing the situation as it developed, rather than controlling it from the front. The cover-up raises an obvious and under-examined question about strategic coherence. If the Molech gate posed a risk significant enough to tamper with Primarch memories over, why wasn't the gate destroyed? The Emperor had decades, potentially centuries, between his initial visit and the outbreak of the Horus heresy. The Primarchs existed. The power had transferred. The gate had served its immediate purpose for the Emperor's plans. He had a guardian on the world who was incapable of permanent death. Exactly the kind of agent capable of being given a terminal order and executing it regardless of personal cost. The order was simple: close the gate, destroy the mechanism, remove the vulnerability. That order was never given. Instead, the Emperor maintained a garrison on a world he'd been hoping his enemies would never find, and his enemies found it. They found it because Horus found the shape of the absence. When Horus reviewed command logs from the Molech visits during the preparation of his campaign, he found that the record was continuous on either side of certain periods and simply missing in the middle. Not erased in a way that announced deletion, pages removed rather than burned, the binding intact but the content gone. The cover-up was precise enough to excise the specific content, but not thorough enough to eliminate the negative space that content had occupied. Horus didn't need to know what was at Molech to know that something was there. He followed the outline of a secret to its source. He entered the same gate, walked the same warp realm the Emperor had walked. The established lore records the outcome. After the Battle of Molech, Horus stood at the height of his powers, augmented by the blessings of all four Chaos gods. All four. The same access point, the same warp realm, and the same mechanism now leveraged by the being who was going to come within a fractional margin of killing the Emperor and dismantling everything the Emperor had spent tens of thousands of years building. Whatever the Emperor had secured at Molech through bargain, deception, or combat, he had not secured it. The gate remained open. The cover-up crumbled along the contour of its own absence. The most dangerous human being in the Horus heresy walked through the Emperor's door using the Emperor's key. The canonical account of Slaanesh's birth is tied to the fall of the Eldar, and the timeline of the fall is one the established lore handles with more complexity than a single date can carry. Sources place the fall in the M30 to M31 window, some fixing it in M31, others tying Slaanesh's birth to conditions that immediately preceded the Great Crusade's launch in approximately 798 M30. The imprecision matters less than the process the fall describes, because Slaanesh didn't arrive in a moment. The Chaos God of Excess coalesced over approximately 5,000 years, beginning around M25 with the onset of the Eldar civilization's long, self-destructive hedonistic decline, and culminating in the cataclysmic full emergence at the fall itself. 5 millennia of gestation. The Eldar were the most psychically sophisticated species in the galaxy at their height, and their civilization numbered in the billions across thousands of worlds. As that civilization turned inward and corrupt, as their emotional excess and spiritual dissolution accumulated across thousands of years, the psychic weight of their collective experience poured into the warp and began to coalesce into something coherent. The process was slow in mortal terms, catastrophically fast by the standards of warp entity formation, and loud in the immaterium the entire time. The way a geological fault doesn't announce itself until it breaks, but the pressure has been building for centuries before anyone on the surface notices. The warp storms that defined the age of strife, the millennia-long chaos that fractured human interstellar civilization, isolated world from world, and made organized galactic society impossible for roughly 5,000 years, are described in the established lore as the buildup that led to Slaanesh's birth, not a consequence of it. The storms didn't happen because Slaanesh arrived. The storms were Slaanesh in the process of arriving. The psychic pressure of a civilization of billions disintegrating over millennia, accumulating in the immaterium, generating ripple effects in the warp that propagated outward and shattered the stability that human spacefaring required. Every warp storm that stranded a human colony, every age of strife atrocity that cascaded from planetary isolation, every generation of humanity ground down in a darkness that lasted 5,000 years, all of it was the pressure wave of something enormous being born in the warp. The full emergence, the cataclysmic birth event, had a specific and immediate effect recorded across multiple lore sources. When Slaanesh's consciousness snapped fully into existence, the birth cleared the warp storms it had spent millennia generating. The Eye of Terror opened in their place. and the path that had been impassable for centuries became navigable again. The Great Crusade launched at 798 M30. The enabling condition for that launch, the clearing of the warp storms that had prevented organized interstellar travel, was the terminal event of Slaanesh's emergence. The Emperor's primary military operation launched on a schedule that Slaanesh's arrival had set. The window opened when the fourth Chaos God emerged and the warp stabilized in the birth's wake. That's not the Emperor moving on his own timeline. That's the Emperor moving when an external condition was met, a condition generated by a process that had been running for 5,000 years in the same warp he'd been navigating, in the same immaterium from which he'd drawn power at Molech. Slaanesh is described in the established lore as the last of the major chaos gods to be born, youngest of four, arriving with the collapse of the Eldar, but by no means the weakest. By the time Slaanesh fully emerged, Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle had already been constituted and operating in the warp for millennia. They were already receiving worship, already shaping events in the material universe, already the three foundational powers of chaos against which the Emperor had been psychically bracing for the duration of the Age of Strife. The Emperor had spent those centuries navigating a warp that already contained three fully formed chaos gods, drawing from a psychic medium in which a fourth was accumulating for 5,000 years. The gestation of Slaanesh wasn't occurring elsewhere. It was occurring in the same immaterium the Emperor moved through, made bargains through, and built his plans around. The warp's relationship to linear time isn't interpretation. It's stated as a foundational property of what the warp is across multiple canonical sources. The consistent description in established Warhammer lore is that the warp is completely unbound by physical space, time, or causality. Cause and effect don't apply inside it in the way they apply in the material universe. The Chaos Gods don't experience sequence. They don't move forward through a timeline the way mortals do. Time, for entities native to the immaterium, isn't the medium through which experience unfolds. It's simply one of the features of the material universe that the warp doesn't reproduce. The apparent sequential history of the Chaos Gods' emergence, Khorne first, Nurgle second, Tzeentch third, Slaanesh last, is a framework that mortal perception imposes on a non-linear reality. The sequence is real from inside linear time. Its applicability to what exists inside the warp is a different question entirely. From this established canonical foundation, the following holds as a bounded inference. Once Slaanesh came into existence, its existence in the warp isn't bounded by the mortal timestamp of the fall of the Eldar. Inside the warp, which the canon says operates without causality, outside linear time, the birth event doesn't initiate Slaanesh's presence in that space. It finalizes a presence that, by the warp's own temporal logic, was already constituted. Or more precisely, a presence that exists in a way the word already doesn't cleanly describe, because already implies a before and after structure the warp doesn't organize itself around. The causes flow backward in the immaterium. Slaanesh's full emergence in the material universe at the fall of the Eldar is the anchor for mortal historical reckoning. What that emergence meant for the warp's nonlinear interior is governed by the warp's own temporal logic, not the mortal calendar. State clearly what the evidence does and doesn't establish. No Black Library text in the available research explicitly states Slaanesh was retroactively present at Molech during the Emperor's visit. That direct statement isn't available. What the canon establishes is the set of premises from which that inference follows. The warp is outside causality. The Chaos Gods exist within the warp. Slaanesh is a Chaos God. Warp temporal logic is non-linear. The conclusion that Slaanesh's presence in any given warp space can't be determined by consulting a mortal calendar follows from those premises. It's a careful derivation from confirmed foundations. The audience engaging seriously with this argument will know the distinction, and the argument is honest about where the inference tier begins. Now hold both halves of the Molech evidence simultaneously. The Emperor entered a warp gate on Molech and made a transaction in the Chaos Realm accessible through it, before the formal birth of Slaanesh by mortal reckoning. When Horus used the same gate during the heresy, the identical access point, the identical warp realm, he emerged with the blessings of all four Chaos gods. All four. Slaanesh's blessing was among them. The warp realm at Molech contained all four Chaos gods' presence at the time of Horus's visit. That is the established lore record, explicit and uncontested. The defense can argue, with canonical support, that the Emperor foresaw Slaanesh's birth and managed that knowledge, that he interacted with the three Chaos gods who fully existed at the time, and Slaanesh simply wasn't yet a party. That argument rests on one load-bearing assumption, that linear time applies to warp entities. The canon says it doesn't. If the warp is non-linear, then whether Slaanesh was present in the warp realm at Molech when the Emperor arrived isn't answered by the mortal date of the fall of the Eldar. The mortal date describes a material universe event. The question of what occupied the warp realm at Molech is answered by the warp's own temporal logic. The lore that states the Emperor foresaw Slaanesh's birth and laid plans accordingly is, read carefully, a statement that he was working defensively around a known future threat, not that he controlled it. Foreknowledge of a coming danger is the structural opposite of control over its arrival. He knew, he prepared. The preparation is what we're evaluating. The warp realm at Molech produced all four blessings for Horus. The cover-up crumbled at its own negative space. The webway project was destroyed from the inside. The heresy consumed 9 legions and left the Emperor a deteriorating corpse on a psychic life support mechanism. If the Emperor foresaw Slaanesh's birth and laid plans accordingly, those plans are what we're looking at. The throne is what the plans produced. The Great Crusade's pace, thousands of worlds absorbed in roughly 2 centuries starting at 798 M30, is presented in imperial mythology as the momentum of a righteous idea whose time had come. Humanity, scattered and broken by the age of strife, being gathered back into a single family by a father who had waited long enough to see his children home. The Interrex make that framing difficult to sustain. They were a human civilization. The established lore is unambiguous on this point. Spanning approximately 30 star systems at the time of the Great Crusade in the 31st millennium. Highly advanced, interstellar in reach, technologically sophisticated enough to have maintained and developed their capability through the same age of strife that had reduced most human worlds to pre-industrial subsistence. Their culture had developed its own relationship with alien species, its own philosophical and social architecture, its own answer to the question of how humanity should organize itself among the stars. These weren't refugees barely maintaining continuity on a marginal world. They were a functional, multi-system polity that had survived the worst period in human history and built something. The established lore is explicit on the encounter. Horus invaded the advanced human civilization Interrex, a legion, a Primarch, a military campaign against humans who had earned their independence through 5,000 years of the worst conditions the galaxy produced. The Diasporex complicate the image further, a nomadic, democratic confederation of humans and aliens living aboard a vast collection of ancient starships, mobile and decentralized, organized around principles of self-governance that had nothing to do with Terra or the imperial model. Mixed in composition, humans and aliens together, which made them ideologically unacceptable to the Imperium, regardless of their human founding political philosophy. The response to both was consistent: military force, absorption or destruction. No preserved political independence, negotiated on the other civilization's terms. This wasn't reunification, it was consolidation. Reunification presupposes a shared framework you're inviting people back into, an acknowledgement that those who left are kin, that the divergence was circumstantial, that returning is a homecoming rather than a surrender. The Crusade's actual operational pattern against the Interrex and the Diasporex was the elimination of any human political structure capable of functioning as a competing model. Before that model could attract enough worlds, develop enough institutional gravity, and demonstrate enough success to make the imperial claim to humanity's singular future contestable. The strategic calculus, stated without euphemism. 30 human star systems in the Interrex at the time of the Crusade. Give that civilization another generation of independent development, another century of technological advancement, political stabilization, and cultural production. And what is that number? 50 systems? 100? Human civilizations that independently develop advanced technology, stable governance, and interstellar reach don't stay conveniently small. They grow. They develop magnetic pull on neighboring worlds. Other human populations, given a choice between two working models of civilization, might choose the one that has been functioning in their region of space rather than the one that is arriving at speed from Terra with a legion attached. And if a dozen Interrex-scale civilizations had survived the Age of Strife intact and developed in parallel for 2 more centuries while the Imperium was still completing its initial formation, the Emperor's project would have arrived to find not scattered, desperate worlds hungry for order, but established alternative powers with their own claims on humanity's direction, their own military capability, and their own accumulated legitimacy. The window for consolidation was finite. Every year the Crusade delayed was a year the alternatives had to grow. That calculation explains the pace. Thousands of worlds in 2 centuries is a rate that accepts enormous operational costs. Military overextension, the resentments generated by force over persuasion, the cultural violence of imposing a single model at the speed of conquest, because the cost of allowing the alternatives to mature was calculated as worse. An idealist who believes his model is self-evidently superior doesn't move at that speed. An idealist who believes his model's viability depends on eliminating the alternatives before they can demonstrate that they work. That being moves at exactly the pace the Great Crusade moved. The Emperor's most urgent fear in the Great Crusade wasn't the alien, not the orc, not the Eldar remnants. It was the possibility of humanity solving the problem of interstellar civilization independently, in ways that didn't require the Imperium and didn't leave room for it. Things that weren't human could be pointed at with a legion. Things that were human, that could compete with the imperial model on human terms, that could offer humanity a genuinely different answer that actually worked. Those required elimination before they became examples. The Interrex were an example. They were eliminated. The Crusade moved on. There is a character-level framework that explains how a being of the Emperor's documented capability still ends up reactive, still ends up arriving fractionally too late at each successive crisis. It doesn't require him to be incompetent. The explanation is in the cost structure of what he was. To know too much is a type of suffering in itself. He had been alive for tens of thousands of years before the Great Crusade launched. His foresight operated across billions of possible futures simultaneously. Superficially, that sounds like the ultimate strategic advantage, a war planner who can see every branch of the decision tree before committing to a move. Over enough centuries, across enough decisions, it starts functioning like a different kind of constraint. Every choice sits at a junction of possible futures. You commit, and the paths you didn't take don't disappear. They persist as the full weight of everything that could have gone differently from that point. Every failure mode attached to every option you rejected. Every downstream consequence of the path you chose cascading out for decades. Across tens of thousands of years, across thousands of decisions, each ramifying into hundreds of long-term effects, the compounding of those branches generates a kind of temporal vertigo that has no mortal equivalent. Not ignorance, the structural opposite of ignorance. Seeing so much that the certainty required for decisive, irreversible action keeps being undermined by comprehensive awareness of every way the decision can fail. The Molech gate posed a risk. Preserving it also served a purpose. He could see both futures. He preserved it and hoped the risk didn't materialize. Hope is what you have when certainty fails you, regardless of how many futures you can see. The established lore describes the Emperor's psychic power as constantly keeping the Chaos Gods in the warp at bay, preventing their intrusion into the material universe, protecting humanity from a pressure that would devour it instantly if the barrier failed. That framing is worth examining precisely. Keeping something at bay is a defensive posture. A wall holds against pressure. It doesn't project force outward, doesn't eliminate the source of the pressure, doesn't resolve the underlying tension. The Emperor's relationship to the Chaos Gods, even at the peak of his power, commanding the greatest military force in human history, physically present on the front lines of the crusade, is framed in the language of containment. He was the dam, not the drought. A dam responds to water level. It doesn't control the weather upstream. The lore also suggests, in community analysis consistent with the canonical warp mechanics, that the Chaos Gods may have been altered by the Emperor's very existence, that his presence in the warp as a psychic force of unprecedented scale changed the nature of the entities he was containing, that a being of his magnitude interacting repeatedly with the immaterium over tens of thousands of years reshaped its residents as much as their existence complicated his plans. If that reading holds, he was a variable in his own equation. You can't cleanly model the outcome of a strategic game when your own moves alter the payoff functions of the opposing players. When the act of containing the Chaos Gods also, over enough time, changes what those gods are and how they respond. Across tens of thousands of years, the Emperor's capacity for clean forward calculation was compromised by his own inseparability from the system he was trying to manage. Walk the decisions in sequence, and the reactive pattern stops being a theory. The Molech visit comes first. Before the Great Crusade, before the Primarchs existed, before any legion had moved beyond Terra, the Emperor travels to a warp gate to acquire the capability his plan requires. That is a gap being filled, a resource collected because it wasn't already available. The image of the Emperor as master architect implies a being who began with a complete blueprint and executed it from existing material. Molech is the moment where the Emperor, facing a capability he didn't have, crossed into the realm of chaos to obtain it. That is improvisation made necessary by a constraint the plan apparently didn't initially resolve on its own terms. The Primarchs follow. 20 demigod sons, designed as the command layer for the Crusade's legions, each a vessel for a fragment of the Emperor's soul. A deliberately engineered solution to the specific problem of needing superhuman commanders capable of leading Astartes' forces at galactic scale. The design was intentional. Then the warp, churning with Slaanesh's 5,000-year gestation, generating the storms that defined the Age of Strife, scattered the Primarchs before the Emperor could deploy them. He spent years, then decades, locating them across the galaxy, recovering them in whatever order chance allowed, rather than the sequence the plan required. They arrived piecemeal, embedded in cultures he hadn't chosen, shaped by circumstances he hadn't designed them for. Magnus raised on a world that celebrated psychers when the Emperor had forbidden unsanctioned psychic development in the legions. Angron pulled from a slave fighter's arena, carrying neural implants in his skull, the butcher's nails, that the Emperor reportedly couldn't remove without killing him, leaving the Primarch of the 12th Legion traumatized and in constant pain before anyone had the chance to deploy him. Curs shaped by a world of perpetual darkness and violence into something that barely resembled the sun the blueprint described. 20 instruments arrived broken, rearranged by alien circumstance and out of order. The Emperor adapted each time. That isn't a blueprint being executed. That is a plan being continuously revised as the pieces arrive in states the plan never specified. The Great Crusade's launch follows. The enabling condition, the clearing of the warp storms that had isolated human worlds from each other for millennia, was the direct consequence of Slaanesh's full emergence. The storms cleared because Slaanesh arrived. The Emperor's primary military operation began when an external event created the conditions for it. He had been preparing, building Terra's defenses, organizing the early legions, waiting for the path through the warp to become viable again. The crusade launched when the fourth Chaos God's birth finally opened the road. That is the Emperor moving on a schedule set by the warp, not a schedule he controlled. The withdrawal from frontline command produces the most structurally significant pivot. The Emperor stepped back from active command of the crusade, elevated Horus to War Master over all Primarchs and all legions, concentrating supreme military authority over the entire Imperium's armed force in a single individual, and returned to Terra. The destination isn't disputed. He returned to begin the Imperial Webway project, an attempt to construct a warp-free transit network for the Imperium using the ancient infrastructure the Eldar had built and largely abandoned. The project would have given Imperial ships and communications a pathway through the galaxy that bypassed the chaos-infected warp entirely. The Webway project is significant precisely because of when it was initiated. The Great Crusade had been running for decades using warp travel as its primary mode of interstellar movement. The same warp that contained all four Chaos Gods, the same non-linear medium whose properties had been a structural problem since Molech. The Emperor recognized, partway through his own military campaign, that the existing arrangement wasn't sustainable at the scale humanity needed. He retreated from the front lines to build a replacement infrastructure. An architect who had genuinely anticipated this problem from the beginning would have built the Webway alternative before committing the crusade to warp travel, not after decades of reliance on it had already created the dependency the project was meant to resolve. The Webway project is a mid-course correction. Mid-course corrections are evidence of the course needing to change. The project's destruction then completes the loop in the most direct possible way. Magnus the Red, perceiving Horus's corruption through his Psyker's sight, needed to warn the Emperor immediately. He had no sanctioned channel for the message. The Emperor had prohibited unsanctioned psychic development in the legions, and Magnus's legion had developed exactly that. And the irony that Magnus was trying to use forbidden capability to save his father's most important project is one of the heresy's defining structural cruelties. Magnus forced the warning through psychically, tearing through the wards protecting the Webway construction. The wards collapsed. The psychic protections failed. The project the Emperor had abandoned the front lines of his own war to build was destroyed from the inside in a single catastrophic moment by one of the sons whose memories had been altered to hide the very secret the project was built to protect against. The memory tampering is the thread connecting all of it into a single causal chain. The Emperor didn't trust his sons with the truth of Molech, so when critical information needed to travel through one of those sons at emergency speed, it traveled through a sealed and unchanneled psychic breach that destroyed the most important construction project in the Imperium. Magnus wasn't trying to betray anyone. He was trying to save his father's plan. He destroyed it because the plan had never been explained to him, because the full scope of what was being built, why it was fragile, and what it was protecting against had been kept from the sons whose memories had been altered to conceal the foundation underneath. The Horus elevation closes the sequence. War Master over all Primarchs. Supreme military authority over the entire Imperium's armed force, concentrated in a single individual. The same individual whose radicalization had been fed by the discovery of gaps in the Molech logs, gaps the Emperor's own cover-up had created. The tampered memories left an absence. The absence revealed the secret's shape. The revelation of the shape drove Horus's corruption. The corrupted Horus was then given the maximum possible leverage to act on that corruption. Each decision made the next failure worse than it would have been if the prior decision had gone differently. That is compounding consequence. That isn't a pre-designed cascade. Return to the defense one final time, because the Steelman's emotional center deserves a direct answer. The throne isn't the plan. It's what the plan cost. The defenders point at 10,000 years of suffering as proof of the Emperor's commitment, his sacrifice, his enduring will. The prosecution does not dispute the sacrifice. What it notes is that the Golden Throne is where the Emperor arrived after Horus nearly killed him, after the heresy consumed 9 legions and shattered the Imperium, after the Webway project collapsed from the inside, after the sons whose memories he'd altered either turned against him or destroyed what he'd built trying to warn him. The suffering is real. The suffering is also the consequence of the sequence traced above. Both things are true simultaneously, and the defender's position and the prosecution's position don't actually conflict on the facts. They conflict on what the facts demonstrate. The canon states the emperor foresaw Slaanesh's birth and laid plans accordingly. A being who is decaying alone on a psychic life support mechanism for 10,000 years, maintaining the Astronomicon through sheer deteriorating will, sustained by 1,000 daily deaths. That is what the plans produced. That is the outcome the plans arrived at. The sacrifice is genuine. The planning failures that made the sacrifice necessary are also genuine, written in the same lore, visible in the same canonical sequence. The 3 joints the predecessor left unsoldered are now as closed as the available evidence permits. The Molech pact is vengeful spirit, Graham McNeil, Book 29 of the Horus Heresy series, the canonical foundation for everything the Emperor's capability rested on, acquired through a warp transaction whose exact terms the novel leaves contested, preserved in secrecy that collapsed along the contour of its own cover-up. Horus walked through the same gate and emerged with all 4 blessings. The temporal retroactivity is a bounded inference from confirmed canon. The warp is outside causality. The chaos gods exist within it. Once Slaanesh exists, its presence in the warp's non-linear space isn't bounded by the mortal calendar of the fall of the Eldar. No Black Library text states this explicitly. It follows from premises the canon treats as foundational. The audience that engages seriously with this argument will know where the inference tier begins, and this script has been honest about it. The Great Crusade's urgency and the fear of rival human civilizations are one causal chain, not 2 separate threads. The Interrex, with approximately 30 star systems, weren't aliens and weren't remnants. They were a human civilization on an independent developmental trajectory, absorbed by force because the window for consolidation before competitors could entrench wasn't unlimited. The Emperor's most urgent fear wasn't things that couldn't challenge the Imperium on human terms. It was things that could. The psychological cost of immortality is the explanatory mechanism. A being navigating billions of possible futures across tens of thousands of years, who crossed into the realm of chaos to obtain the capability his plan required, who foresaw Slaanesh's birth and built around a known future threat he couldn't prevent. That being's judgment erodes not because he was weak, but because the volume of what he could see outran the certainty required to act decisively on any of it. Foresight at sufficient scale and duration functions less like an advantage and more like a comprehensive inventory of everything that can go wrong. Which leaves the question the evidence can't answer. If Slaanesh's existence in the warp isn't bounded by the mortal timestamp of the fall of the Eldar, if the warp realm at Molech contained what it contained regardless of where the mortal calendar sat, was there ever a version of the Emperor's plan whose foundation wasn't already compromised before he finished building it? That question belongs to the comments. Subscribe if you want to keep going.